Thank you for joining us today on the Flowing Through SoCal video podcast. Today, I've got Wayne Rosenbaum with the Environmental Law Group joining us again. I think this is either the third or the fourth time. Always a pleasure to have you on and get your perspective on things from the legal standpoint. So maybe just get the audience a real quick primer on what you do and what kind of cases you work on and what your specialties are.
Thanks, Sean. I have been working in primarily the water aspects of environmental law for the last 30 years. The Environmental Law Group is a very small, it's a specialized firm. We deal strictly with environmental issues. And my particular niche is looking at water law, water quality, water rights, and how we take the regulatory and statutory requirements and merge them into systems that allow our clients to, run a business, have a horse farm, you name it. Small, medium, and large businesses, how do they address these kinds of regulations? So that's what we do.
Okay. So then you're well suited to talk to us about waters of the United States. And I know the definition is sort of swings back and forth over time. And I think it'd be really helpful if you just sort of walk us through the sequence of cases and how the jurisdictional waters or regulated waters or waters of the United States have been defined sort of back and forth over time.
Sure. And this has been a long and winding road. Now, almost all of the cases, or in fact, all of the cases I'm going to talk about today, historically, have looked at waters, the definition of waters of the United States as directly as they affect wetlands. But right up front, we need to make clear that the Clean Water Act, yes, regulates wetlands. It's under Section 404 and 402, but it also regulates a myriad of other things, NPDES permits as an example. And so when we define a term, although the cases I'm going to talk about right now are almost exclusively related to wetlands, the definitions will affect industrial facilities, construction sites, municipal stormwater systems, sanitary sewer systems as well. All of those, in one way or another, are impacted by how we define the water of the United States.
Understood.
So if we go back to the beginning, in the beginning, there was first Riverside Bayview back in 1985.
This is a case called,
the Riverside Bayview. It was a Supreme Court case where the question that was being asked was, hey, if I have a wetland that is adjacent to a clearly definable water of the United States, a water that is involved in commerce, transportation, interstate activities, inland seas or the ocean, which are clearly defined waters of the United States, is that wetland also a water of the United States because it's adjacent? And the Supreme Court in that case said, yeah, it is. Now, what they said in that case was, hey, it is, and what we are relying on is it's called the Chevron doctrine. And the Chevron doctrine said, if the agency says so, we kind of believe them. And I'm shorthanding this, but since that time, since 1985, more recently, Chevron has been overturned. So I'm not sure that if Riverside Bayview were litigated today, we'd come to the same conclusion. However, it is case law from that period. At the same time, in the same year, however, the Supreme Court also heard a case called Swank. And in Swank, what happened was you had an isolated gravel pit that the city of Chicago was going to use as a landfill. However, at the bottom of this gravel pit, there was some water and some ducks, and um, there was an issue. EPA said, no, 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 you can't do that. That's a water of the United States. And the Supreme Court in that case said, hey, no, there's no connection between this isolated gravel pit and some other definable water of the United States that would be used interstate, transportation, et cetera, et cetera.
Hmm.
And so now we had a subset that got carved out that was a lot bigger than just gravel pits. I mean, it affected vernal pools, prairie wetlands, stock pond, all of these other water features that are not. The court said if they're not connected, they're not a water of the United States.
Okay.
Ergo, they are not subject to the Clean Water Act.
Roger that. Okay.
Okay, so that's where we were, and then in 1986, EPA tried and the Army Corps tried to create their first definition of by in the rulemaking of what they meant by a water of the United States, which has been kicked around and kicked and was has been probably rewritten by every administration thereafter. And then in 2006 we get a case called Rapinos. Uh, and Rapinos is then the first case where this question of, hey, what did we really mean? If it's not adjacent and it's not totally disconnected, there's this intermediate class of, well, and again, it deals with the wetland. If the wetland is up gradient, and is not directly connected to a water of the United States, but is connected by way of some conveyance system, some streams, some channels, some whatever, that ultimately gets to a water of the United States. Is that up gradient wetland then a water of the United States?
Hmm.
And the Supreme Court again ponders this, and in this case, we get a multitude of decisions. On the one hand, we have the decision that says, "Hey, if there is any significant nexus between that wetland and that definable water of the United States, that's good enough."
Hmm.
And in that opinion, in that particular opinion, we get 5 or 6 factors that the lower courts might look at in terms of what a nexus is. On the other side, we get another opinion that says, because we never get a majority of the court going one way or another, we get pluralities. And then we get the Scalia opinion that says, no, you have to have a true physical continuous connection in order to be this to say that wetland up gradient is a water of the United States because it is connected to what I'll call a definable water of the United States, a river, something that is involved in interstate commerce, interstate transactions,
Okay.
a sea or an inland ocean. Um, so now you have these two different plurality decisions. And we have in this country now, 11 circuit courts. Some of the circuit courts take the nexus decision, say that's our rule. Some of the circuit courts take you have to have a physical connection rule, the Scalia rule. And so we have a split between the circuits.
Okay.
And we've kind of lived with that up until more recently, which in 2023, we finally get the Sackett decision. And under the Sackett decision, with I would say, a more conservative Supreme Court, they go back and they say, no, the law of the land is the rule is the Scalia decision. There
Okay.
has to be a physical connection. And they define that physical connection with two concepts. One, that there has to be relatively permanent water. that, and particularly at least, and this is where it gets a little flaky, at least in the rainy season, there has to be relatively permanent water. And two, there has to be a continuous surface connection. No breaks, no, the water infiltrates here and gets into the groundwater and pops up over there. It has to be a continuous surface connection.
Okay.
So that's the latest that the Supreme Court has given us. Currently, um, the again EPA and Army Corps under the new Trump administration is trying to do a rulemaking to then explain that opinion in greater detail. But I, I am of the opinion that rulemaking is fractious within the regulatory agencies themselves, and two, even if they come up with a rule, that it's going to be litigated, and three, I think that rule is only going to be as good as the life of any given administration before the next administration comes along and decides we don't like that rule. So
Right. Right.
yeah,
Right.
but I think the take homes for us, at least on a today basis, is hey, the Supreme Court has said that for a water to be a water of the United States where it is not directly adjacent, there must be a continuous and relatively permanent flow from that wetland to a water of the United States is being defined by a water used or having been used in commerce.
Gotcha. So, oh, right. So that's a very interesting kind of walk through history. And my takeaway is that it's gone sort of back and forth in terms of definitions. And now we're at some point again. And unless Congress does something with the Clean Water Act, we're probably going to be stuck in this sort of swinging back and forth for some time. Um, so in these definitions, there's things like ephemeral streams and intermittent tributaries. Um, what's the difference between those two? So an ephemeral stream and an intermittent tributary in terms of Clean Water Act and jurisdictional definitions.
Okay. Um, and again, before we go there, let me go back a step and say to you, okay, we now have we now have a Supreme Court decision. Each state is, while EPA and the Army Corps are playing with a rulemaking, each state is looking at that and addressing it in their own way. Because remember, it is the states that have preeminent authority over water rights.
Okay,
Okay.
right, right.
And so you're going to have some states that are going to take a very narrow view, and they're going to say, hey, unless it falls clearly within the definition, the Sackett definition, it is not a water of the United States. Other states are going to be more flexible and use their own state authority to do gap filling. But back
Okay.
to your question about difference between an ephemeral stream and an intermittent tributary. Is the question is really, hey, is it if it's an intermittent tributary, we're really asking the question, is this a relatively permanent water that we can go and, and again, there have been some debates between wet states and dry states, but is there water there on on most days? When we talk about an ephemeral stream, what we're really talking about is that concept of a continuous surface connection. So you're getting in one case, we're asking, is there really, can I really connect the dots and go from here to there? And in the other case, I'm asking the question, hey, does the water actually flow down that conveyance, that pipe, uh, you know, on a relatively permanent basis?
So in Southern California, for example, we have lots of uh, intermittent, streams that are not channelized, they're natural, but they only flow during rain events, which might only be 9 days a year, right? So that's definitely not the plurality of the flow, or it doesn't represent a Well, I don't know. Let me ask you, would that represent a continuous connection then?
And that is one of the questions that has arisen. How continuous is continuous? How relatively permanent is relatively permanent?
Yeah,
Beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. And what we're seeing then is various states filling that gap in different ways. If you were in, some of the southern states, they would take a very narrow view and say, "Oh no, it doesn't flow every day, it doesn't count."
right.
In California, California is in the process of passing legislation that would say, "Hey, not only does it count, we're even going to make more things. We're going to be having an even more expansive definition." And then the question becomes, enforcement authority. A state has to be able to not only say, define this as being the equivalent of a water of the United States, but if they cannot rely on the federal statute, do they have the enforcement authority within the state to say, okay, not only do we say this is a water that has to be protected, but we got the tools to protect it with.
So varying, taking into account this varying by state, let's throw an example out there of a low spot. Let's say you've got a gigantic open field, thousands of acres, and there's a low spot that just holds water year round, but it does not have a continuous connection to any river, any adjacent flowing, anything. It's just sort of a low spot. And maybe it's got wildlife and ducks and things like that. So by the current definition or jurisdiction, that would not be an example of a water of the United States.
Correct. Going all the way back to Swank. If it's an
Okay.
isolated wetland, an isolated water body, it's not subject to the Clean Water Act. Caution, Will Robinson. I didn't say anything about, the Endangered Species Act or a
Right.
whole bunch of
Right.
other, state and federal regulations, but it's not subject to the Clean Water Act.
Right. So if a developer wanted to go in there and fill it with clean fill and build it an apartment complex on top of that, they from a Waters United States standpoint, they would be able to do that.
That would be correct. They
Yeah.
could they could build a landfill there as the city of Chicago did.
Right. All right. That's promising. So what about if someone was to build a dike or a dam to cut off a wetland from the river? I mean, in other words, could you create a non-jurisdictional water by damming it like that? What would that look
Mm,
like?
I don't think that's a viable strategy, because if the connection exists, then it exists. And to build that dam or whatever else, then really you are in order to do that, you would be filling a water of the United States, that creek or that
Okay, right.
stream. No, I can't, I
That's not
can't get it.
gonna that wouldn't
That's not going to
happen.
fly.
You can't create a non-jurisdictional from a jurisdictional.
That's right.
You spoke earlier about how Clean Water Act affects receiving, what the definition then, receiving water in PDS permit holder discharger, right? So you've got
Mhm.
this whole the concept of the NPDS permitting scenario. So let's talk about that in terms of the current definition of waters of the United States. So let's say there's a new industrial facility and they need to get possibly they need to get an NPDS discharge permit under state IGP, or whatever the situation is. And if this industrial facility discharges to a mostly dry, not relatively permanent flowing creek, um, is dry most of the year, and then maybe at the end of this is the end of the LA River, for example, or some receiving water. Would that facility, that new industrial facility, need an NPDS permit if all of their site drainage goes into this relatively dry, not permanent flowing creek?
The answer is no, but okay. And historically, in our IGP our IGP permits, and I believe it's also true of all of our NEPTES permits, we've had what's called a NONA provision, a notice of
Right.
non-applicability.
Right.
I don't need a permit because I don't discharge to a water of the United States.
Oh, there you go.
And so what this new decision under Swank does is effectively expand that definition of what is not a water of the United States, and therefore I don't need a permit. I would file for a notice of non-applicability. Again, caution, caution, caution. Every state, and I'll use California because we do most of our work here. In California, if I were to do that, my expectation would be that somebody at a water board would come back to me and say, aha, but it still is a water of the state. Go get
Right.
a state permit. And there, be careful what you wish for because you may be happier with the federal regulatory structure than the state structure. And again, that's going to vary from state to state, but
Sure. And right now, I think we've got coming up potentially is another round of potential voting on Senate Bill 601 in
right.
California. So yeah, let's talk about that for a minute.
Okay. SB 601, its intent is to be gap filler legislation, is to essentially say, hey, all of those waters that we had previously thought of as being waters of the United States under Rapinos, we're going to now create a new class of waters in the state of California called nexus waters. And think of those. So now we're going to have waters of a water of the United States, and then we're going to have waters of the state, some of which are going to be these nexus waters, and that's how they propose filling the gap. Now, SB 601 also goes well beyond that in a couple of ways, in that it now would say anybody who discharges into a nexus water needs a state permit,
Oh,
not just our traditional, industrial construction municipal, but any discharger into a nexus water would need a permit, which is very expansive. Two, it adds a provision that allows for citizen suit enforcement of nexus waters, of failure to comply with the obligations if you discharge to a nexus water. So uh, it is gap filling plus. And again, we're seeing
interesting.
variations from state to state. California always seems to be the most expansive, most progressive, or if you want to call it that, in terms of how they handle these things. Other states, have said, okay, yeah, we're going to fill the gap, but we're going to fill the gap by just mirroring what would have been. Other states have said, nah, it's not our problem.
Yeah,
So,
interesting.
yeah,
Well, hey, yeah, hey, Wayne, again, thanks. Always informative. I come away with lots of new information and sometimes some additional questions, but great. Thanks for joining us, and we'll make sure we have you back on as we get deeper into this 601 debate here in California coming up probably, I don't know, maybe later this year. But
yeah.
again, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.